Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host for today, Jess Sutherland, here with Marlène Laruelle. Marlène is a professor at Luis University in Rome and director of the Illiberal Studies programme, and her research focuses in part on the rise of illiberal movements and their political and cultural expressions. And she's here today with us to speak just about that, really. Marlène, it's great to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for your invitation.
So a tradition we are keeping from our previous series of Democracy Differently is that we always ask every one of our guests exactly the same first question. So in a sentence, what do you see as the single biggest problem with democracy?
Well, I think it's growing inability to deal with the issue of rising social economic inequality, the feeling of social and cultural disintegration. That's for me the biggest issue with democracy right now.
Great, thanks. So let's get stuck in, I guess. So I think the first question I really need to ask you is, what exactly is illiberalism? I think it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but we don't always have a particular definition of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I understand it, illiberalism has to be approached as not as a regime type, as it was for a very long approach, but as an ideology. So I see it as a kind of coherent ideological universe that has emerged as a reaction to liberalism as it is practiced today. So it has to be understood always in its relationship to liberalism, right? So to be, in my definition, illiberal, you need to have already experienced some form of liberalism, and then having a narrative that say, well, we consider that this liberalism has failed to deliver us security, dignity, collective meaning. So that's that kind of backlash. And then it's offering some other alternative political offer to liberalism.
Great, thank you. And hopefully that's a really nice introduction for the rest of our discussion today as well. So could you explain a little bit more about what an illiberal state might look like then, and how this might differ from a democratic one?
Yeah, so if we shift from the ideological field to the kind of more regime type or an illiberal state, or what we often have been calling illiberal democracy, even if the term is sometimes considered as not a very good one, it's that an illiberal state doesn't necessarily abolish election or reject democracy, right? But it's promoting a very majoritarian, nation-centric understanding of democracy, in which electoral legitimacy is more important than pluralism, institutional check, or minority protection, right? And then it's a state that focuses on a very unified vision of the nation, so dreaming about cultural homogeneity, traditional hierarchy, this idea of a sovereign decision making, and therefore that is not very open to multiculturalism, inclusion, or progressivism, right? So I think the key element is not to imagine that it's the presence or the absence of election. It's more how the state wants to conceptualize what is legitimacy, what is authority, what are the rights of the citizen. That's where the difference is.
Amazing, thanks. So you mentioned earlier that illiberalism is a kind of a reaction to liberalism and perhaps even neoliberalism, if I could add that one in. So what exactly is it reaction against? So I guess the question I have for you here is, do illiberal ideologies kind of have to define liberalism in order to impose it in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the complex aspects when we want to study that liberalism itself is so broad, right? It's such a huge normative symbolic system that we may be thinking about liberalism as an abstract political philosophy, or liberalism as the way it is practiced and institutionalized in contemporary liberal democracy regime. So illiberalism is always targeting some of the script of liberalism. Either it's complaining about political liberalism, or it's complaining about economic neoliberalism, or it's especially targeted geopolitical liberalism, the liberal world order, or it has something against cultural liberalism. So in each country and each political culture, this kind of illiberalism is kind of adapted to what is seen as the key issue with liberalism, and that may differ depending on the country. That may also evolve over the years. So you indeed need to first see the way liberalism is imagined to then understand which kind of illiberalism will offer which kind of response.
Great, thanks. Are there specific liberal principles then that illiberalism kind of always opposes, or is the landscape of illiberal thought kind of much more fragmented than that?
So it's fragmented, but because it's very context sensitive, but you still have broad liberal principles that illiberal movement tend to contest systematically, right? Whatever the political group. So it's usually the primacy of individual right over collective identity, the primacy of supranational institution over the kind of sovereignty of the nation state, the universality of liberal norms are also contested, and the idea that social progress necessarily involves moral and cultural liberalization. So I think that are the core elements where whatever the version, an illiberal political offer will be challenging all these elements in different combinations.
And I guess they challenge these in different ways and in the ways that they try and promote their own values. And so in some of your work, I know that you outline 5 criteria of different kinds of political projects that illiberals might try to promote. What are these criteria and why are they so important to the illiberal thought?
Yeah, so in my definition, I think there are 5 criteria that you will find in every liberal political offer. As I said, then they can be moderate or radically interpreted. They can be combined in different ways, but you more or less always have these 5 criteria. So promoting majoritarian solution, that a strong executive power against minority right, promoting nation state sovereignty against international supranational institution, promoting a kind of multipolarity vision of the world order, very often with the narrative about a civilizational multipolarity against liberal universalism, the idea of cultural homogeneity of the nation against multiculturalism, and the idea of kind of a traditional values hierarchy against progressivism, right? So you always have this idea that you should be restoring order or rootedness because the liberalism has been excessively fluid or disembedded. So that's why this criteria for me be important, because that they are telling us that illiberalism, it's an ideological project, and it's not only about democratic institutional erosion or about authoritarian behavior. It's more than that. It has a vision of the world and of what should be the social order.
Do you have any examples of the ways that these criteria kind of are being promoted by various illiberal movements for us?
Yeah, absolutely. If you take, for example, Russia, which has been probably the first state to really almost officialize an illiberal worldview, very kind of sophisticatedly developed under Vladimir Putin, their first opposition was the liberal international order. So the first thing they were opposing was the geopolitical liberalism that was making the US being the unipolar hegemon and the former, I mean, the Soviet Union having lost and Russia having lost its status. So they backlashed first against geopolitical liberalism and then gradually against political liberalism, against cultural liberalism. So, for example, Russia entered in illiberalism as a state construction mostly because of the geopolitical aspect. But in the majority of European countries, I would say that economic neoliberalization has been one of the key elements that has been the driver of this illiberal reaction. And then depending on the countries, you may have the same kind of social economic driver, but the leaders will be framing things differently. So for example, I think in the US, because the US has been culturally already very polarized and divided in these 2 kind of culture war, then everything related to kind of wokeness or so-called cultural Marxism has been a key element for example, the Trump administration as a way to try to gather popular support. So each leader adapt his own illiberalism and critique of liberalism depending of what makes sense electorally, what seems to be gathering popular support, what is an easy arguments against liberalism to be made.
Amazing. And you mentioned there about the idea of kind of fighting wokeness. Could you say more about that and kind of what the project there is for illiberal thought?
Yeah, I think this idea of fighting wokeness, it has become kind of, a unifying flagship for a lot of illiberal movements because it's a pretty easy way to exemplify illiberalism turn toward culture more than toward political or institutional struggle, right? So once you move to the level of moral and identity politics, then the political struggles become more easily kind of black and white. And so it's this idea that you have unelected cultural elites that are very progressive and cosmopolitan, and that they are, in a sense, limiting or silencing the voices of the majority of the population that would be less exclusive and less progressive. So it's this idea that liberalism has been bringing nihilism, relativisms on the way we define the social order, that it has been deconstructing so many of the values that were traditionally forming a society, that it's a deconstructive, dangerous move. And then that's why the illiberal see through wokeness, right? It's deconstructing the social order and what is giving meaning to the society, and therefore they need to fight against that. And it's a good example on how much illiberalism is putting culture or identity at the core of the political fight more than just kind of institution or voting behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point and hopefully leads on to my next question. So you mentioned the US, for example, and the kind of fight against wokeness there. But I think the term illiberalism has become more widely used in probably the last decade or so, especially around this democratic backsliding that we're seeing in the US and everywhere else as well. So is there a connection here between the rise in popularity of illiberal thought and democratic backsliding, or is it a kind of chicken and egg situation that's going on?
So they are, of course, connected, but I don't think it's a simple, cause and effect relationships. I think illiberalism has a kind of feedback loop effect on democratic erosion. So I would say you first have democratic erosion, loss of trust in institutions, rise of social economic inequality, people feeling disempowered, losing the feeling that they have political agency, that they have cultural values. And then you have illiberal political offer that arrive at the political response to what is perceived as the failure of liberal democracy. But because once the offer is crystallized politically, they are reinforcing the democratic erosion, right? So that's why I think it's this kind of feedback loop effect. But I think democratic erosion is arriving by itself, right? It's liberal democracies are having difficulties delivering their promises. And then the alternative political offer arrive and accelerate the decline, the questioning, the way of trying other political alternative, the kind of challenging what was considered as obvious before, and so on.
Amazing. And while we're talking about kind of alternative political offerings, I think illiberalism is often used synonymously, especially in journalism, with other contexts such as concepts, such as fascism, authoritarianism, any other kind of far right terms as well. What is the difference in your view between illiberal thought and then all of these other concepts?
So for me, the difference is really important. And of course, I can see why we tend to put them together with this idea that these terms are kind of more or less saying the same things. But I think if you really looked empirically what is happening in our society, you see that illiberalism, in fact, it's a selective reformulation of liberalism. So it's moving away from some liberal norms, but keeping some other, like neoliberalism, for example, economically, remain a kind of key criteria for illiberal regime. So for me, illiberalism, it's a byproduct of liberalism when it failed. It's producing illiberalism, while fascism and authoritarianism would be put in really different kind of directly contrasting kind of a conceptual entity compared to liberal democracy, right? So for me, fascism, it's a very historically specific ideology that need revolutionary violence and a kind of totalizing vision of society to be really labeled fascism. So you may have some illiberal regime that have fascist tendencies, but considering that all illiberal political offers are fascist, I think it's too short in the analysis, and it's not helping understanding the mechanisms. And the same authoritarianism, it's more about the mode of governance of a society in restricting political competition and civil liberties, but you don't necessarily have a coherent ideological project in authoritarian regimes. It's more about practicing power than about having an ideology. So it can overlap. You can have an authoritarian regime that have a coherent illiberal ideology, Russia being probably the best example, where it's in practice authoritarian and ideologically liberal. But you can have authoritarian regime that either have another ideology that you wouldn't call illiberal, or just have kind of almost an empty ideological doctrine. And then you can have a liberal political offer that's sometimes in tension, if you think Trump in the US is, but think about Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She's sharing a lot of this illiberal ideological universe, but in practice, she's functioning very well, or more or less well, in a liberal democratic framework without challenging the institution. So you can also have a moderate illiberal offer that is still functioning in our liberal societies.
Great, thanks. And what, in your view, is it that draws citizens, everyday citizens, towards these illiberal ideologies and supporting illiberal leaders, whether more moderate ones or more extreme?
Well, I think it's a combination, right? It's both material, cultural, and symbolic, right? I think it's both an effect of economic dislocation, social economic dislocation that has been growing with the shift to neoliberalism and then to neoliberal globalization. So that's the fear of losing your social economic status, I think, is the key driver. It's also a feeling of cultural marginalization, this idea that you are not worth anything in the society, that you cannot find your place in the society, that everything has become so fluid and deconstructed that it's become difficult to know where you are in the symbolic kind of hierarchy of your society. And then it's a feeling, and not only a feeling, a reality, I think, of loss of political agency. So the idea that democracy has become a kind of depoliticized technocratic body that you cannot really influence anymore. And then you may be voting, but you don't see the changes happening. So I think it's that combination of social economic factor, cultural imagination of your place in the society, and the feeling that institutions are not able to represent you anymore, and that you are getting silenced or you are becoming invisible to your political elites, that I think push people toward the liberal offer, because the liberal offer seems to be offering belonging, collective purposes, and it's also giving at least the impression of moral clarity. Like there are rules, there are order, there are hierarchy in the society, there are room for everybody, but in a hierarchical system. And I think but all that presented as restoring, but not undermining the popular sovereignty, right? So it's all presented as a renewal of democracy and not as shifting away from democracy. And so I think that's why it works also, because people are looking for a way of making democracy more efficient, and illiberalism seems to be offering a way of making democracy more efficient. I'm not sure it's doing, but at least that's the offer that voters may hope for.
So do social and cultural imaginaries play a very key role there then, when people are,
I think so,
kind of looking
yeah,
for
I think they are central. Yeah, I think they are central, and I think they have been not so much studied as such, right? Because the scholarship has been mostly looking at, political leader, the cult of the leader, the charismatic figure, the voting, the decay of institutional trust. But I think cultural imaginaries are central, right? People need to have a feeling of belonging. They need meanings, not only as individual, but collective meanings. They need national meaning. They need to have a kind of symbolic references to community, to the nation, to their place in the world. And I think many of the successes of illiberal offer is that it's coming with cultural production. It may be coming with music, it's coming with movies, it's coming with visual, even, symbolic visual of representing the nation, the flags, things that are creating affective politics, and people respond to that. Historic fair, for example, Hungary under Orban has been really like leading in recreating this kind of historical reenactment, a big fair where people can feel they are sharing something, across generation that make them Hungarian. So I think illiberals have been very good at reactivating cultural imaginaries, while liberal offer, because it seems universalistic, abstract, rational, technocratic, in a sense, it had got emptied of cultural imaginaries. And I think that's one of the challenges, that liberalism doesn't seem to have any imagination to offer anymore to its citizens.
So does the kind of cultural offerings you've just mentioned, do they play a role as a form of propaganda as we kind of see it more traditionally then?
Yeah, of course. I mean, depending how you want to define propaganda, and if you consider propaganda as being something that every country have one way or another, there may be pluralistic propaganda, but there is still something like propaganda. But here, of course, the change in the media ecosystem has been dramatically influential, of course, in promoting illiberal views, because we function now in a very entirely commercially based media ecosystem, not only social media, but just, television and newspaper, where mostly media has become the space for elements that will be dividing the nation, not unifying, not reconciliating the nation. So in that case, the liberal political offer may navigate well because it's very critical of the status quo. So it gets kind of automatically promoted, plus algorithms, strategies. But then propaganda, with quotation mark, can be broader, right? It can also be a religious institution. You have, especially in Western Europe, for example, that is a very secularized space. You have a revival of a kind of identitarian Christianity. Doesn't mean people go to church, doesn't mean they really believe in God, but they have the feeling of something of Christian identity culturally that make them separate from Muslim immigrants, for example, or that give them some unity. So I think there have been a lot of these elements that play a role. Plus you have grassroots movements that have been genuinely influential. I mean, a large part of the success of MAGA in the US is not only Trump himself, but his capacity to have a grassroots movement that want to reinvent politics, a kind of very popular pop culture version of politics that would make it available to every American citizen. And that has been working.
So we've talked a lot about right-leaning illiberalism, I think, so far, with your examples, but are there any other examples of kind of leftist illiberalism?
Yeah, so that's a big debate, because it, of course, depends on the way you want to define illiberalism. Then you would be able to include some leftist movement. So if you think about some of the criteria I was mentioning, like nation-state sovereignty, majoritarianism, strong executive power, you could find that in many what we call the sovereign left movement, that are critical of the European Union, that would like a more majoritarian system, that would like more kind of sovereignty in the traditional sense to be revived, that believe in multipolarity world order and not on a Western liberal international order. So that you would find several leftist movement that would share this element. And if you go in the global south, you would find even more leftist movement. The only moment where, at least for Europe and the US, let's say for the global north, where illiberalism and left doesn't work well together is that usually the majority of leftist movement are committed to cultural liberalism, right? They have an inclusive definition of the political community. They welcome multiculturalism, they welcome social progressivism, LGBT rights, and so on. So if you have this kind of traditional values element in the definition of illiberalism, then the left doesn't fit. But if you put the kind of traditional conservative values outside, then yeah, you could identify several leftist movements that would fit the definition, including a growing number of movements that are becoming critical of migration, for example, not in the name of kind of ethnic or cultural incompatibility, but in the name of what the neoliberal system means by bringing cheap workforce from abroad and destroying the kind of the social fabric. So that's the way it has been reframed. So I think there have been some overlaps, of course, and then you can of course think about more radical leftist movement that either are kind of revolutionary on many aspects, or that are promoting, radical cancel culture and so on. Here also, they would on some aspect overlap with illiberalism, but not on every of the 5 elements of the definition.
Amazing, thanks. That's really interesting that a lot of it comes down to this kind of cultural aspect. So one thing we do like to do on this podcast is not just talk about challenges to democracy, but also look to future ways that we can change or fix or protect democracy. So is there anything you think that we can learn from studying illiberalism, especially as if we think about it as distinct from authoritarianism and fascism?
Yeah, I think so. I think it forces us to confront the internal contradiction of liberalism, right? And to shift the debates not so much about democracy, but about liberal democracy. And it invites us to rethink, the tension between democratic participation, technocratic governance, between economic liberalism and social cohesion, right? So I think what illiberalism is telling us is that you cannot have a liberal democracy functioning only on kind of procedural legitimacy and a kind of technocratic neoliberal institution, right? People need storytelling, they need meanings, belonging, they need material security also, but they need collective symbolic identities. And I think that's what illiberal is telling us, is that liberalism will need to reinvent that if you want to win the ideological battle against illiberalism.
Amazing, thank you. And we like to end these episodes with a kind of quick fire round of questions. So the first question that I have for you is, are you hopeful or pessimistic for the future?
Yeah. Well, I'm mostly pessimistic for the short term and medium term future. I think we will have the majority of us to go through some form of illiberal governance, maybe authoritarian governance, before reinventing democracy and maybe rescuing liberalism. But I think for the forthcoming years, the majority of at least Western countries will be going through tough political times. So on that, I'm pessimistic.
And that leads very nicely on to my next question I had for you, which is, what's the most frustrating thing about the current political landscape?
So for me, the frustration, it's not so much the success of illiberal forces, it's the inability of liberalisms to reinvent itself, right? To continue to imagine is the obvious normative solution, so it doesn't have to be challenged, is refusing to participate, to recognize that now you have genuine ideological competition, so you need to work on your arguments to show that, yeah, liberalism is or hopes to be the best option. And what I find frustrating is the tendency of people who identify as liberal, to decredibilize, to refuse to engage into genuine dialogue with the liberal forces. Either they present them as fascist, or it's just racist, or it's just, stupid people who are brainwashed by Russian propaganda or by, Elon Musk on X. And I think it's much more complicated than that, right? So I would like liberalism to accept to re-engage into debates and to come back with a reinvention of liberalism that would be clearly finding solutions. I mean, it's not easy, of course, but at least proposing some, political imaginary that would look credible. And I don't think we are there. I don't think the majority of liberal elites are ready for that kind of very deep introspection moment. So that, for me, it's frustrating.
Same, to be honest. And maybe you've already answered this question, but how do you see the political landscape evolving in the near future?
Yeah, I think illiberalism will remain one of the broader trend, either in its moderate version or in very radical version, as we can see now in the US, with also a transformation of the international scene with growing kind of imperial power. Like, so we had Russia, now we have the US, right? So a really deep transformation of, what is the international law? What is the global order? What are the sovereignty of the states that are getting kind of challenged in a very abrupt way now? So I think we will have to go through that phase and hope that during that time, some kind of grassroots renewal will be able to come. But of course, you always have a moment of tension where you need the grassroots renewal to emerge enough on time before being totally kind of crushed by potentially authoritarian regimes. So it's it's a risky moment, I think, for all the democracies. But I'm afraid we have to go through that risky moment to reinvent ourselves. Otherwise, we are just kind of postponing the moment where we will have to face that. And then history has accelerated and is going faster now than us.
Yes, definitely. And what's the main thing you think listeners should take away from your work and the discussion that we've had today?
So for me, the key takeaway is not to think that illiberalism, it's an external threat to democracy or something. It's not an anomaly, right? It's not a pathology. It's a byproduct of liberalism internal tensions, and therefore we need to address it and not to reject it, right? We need to consider it's part of who we are, and all of us know people that would be politically voting for illiberal movement. So we need to, they are part of us. They are our co-citizens, our co-fellow citizens, and we need to be able to address the genuine grievances that give rise to illiberalism and not consider as something that is external to us and kind of that can just be let outside of the house.
Great, thanks. And a nice, hopefully more light-hearted one for you to end the quickfire round on. If you hadn't become a political philosopher, what profession do you think you would have had instead?
Probably something around, cultural production, museum. I'm a big museography fan, so I think because that's a nice way also to create storytelling about who we are. So I think that's a field where I would have probably reinvent myself.
Great, thanks. So at the beginning of the episode, I asked you to consider what was the biggest problem with democracy right now. So given everything we've discussed so far, if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be and why?
So I think that would be to accept to repoliticize the question that for years we have been outsourced either to, technocracy, expert, market, or thinking there was a kind of obvious normative consensus and even a moral consensus on that. And then to accept that, okay, democracy is also conflict. Conflict can be conflict, not war, but conflict, ideological, can be legitimate, and it's a constructive process, not a pathology. And that's how a democracy should be. We should have disagreement on what the social order is, and let's try to live all together on that. So that for me would be where the only way democracy can kind of reinvent itself.
Thanks. I think that's a great note for us to end on. So, Marlène, it's been great to have you on today. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for the great discussion.
Thank you. And I hope our listeners have enjoyed the podcast today. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe. I've been your host, Jess. Thanks so much for tuning in.